here tonight and talking about coming full circle and talking about sociology. I have an undergraduate in applied economics, so ag economics from the University of Minnesota. And it looks like it's mainly faculty here. I was not a good econ student, and I kept on looking at like the boards in college, and I would see rural sociology, and I'm like, that looks pretty cool. I wonder what that is, and then I just forget. And I wish I had done that, but I went on to get an MED in education and agricultural education, and so it all worked out. But it's kind of fun that I'm like, I get to speak to sociologists. That's awesome because I love sociology. So tonight we're going to go back. If you're going to come back in time with me to a little time capsule, talking about my personal journey growing up here in rural Minnesota and then going away for a good long time in urban areas. And I moved back 5 years ago. So the first thing I want to ask all of you is, what is your rural? This is something that I always like to ask my audience. What is your rural? Because I can guarantee you that growing up near Waldorf on a dairy farm, Mankato is urban and was in the 70s. You can see here now, I know it's hard on this, but right now in the rural urban commuting areas, that's what I have up on the chart right now. Blue Earth County is considered urban in the last census, but I can tell you if you go to the Twin Cities and ask about Mankato, they'll say, oh, that's rural. And I promise you, if you go to Washington, D.C., that if you can ask a lot of people if they can even find Minnesota on a map, we're doing well. So it's all about perspective. But today, when we're talking about what is your rural, I'm referring to this RUCA map, but I'm also referring to Mankato as a general rural area, a regional center. So back in 1975, a long time ago, I was born and I was raised for 4 years in our family's mobile home right next to our dairy farm, which was fantastic, and then we moved into the home place. But throughout this, I have some little tidbits of knowledge that were happening back in 1975. 1975 was a very important year. The Vietnam War ended. We had the Watergate scandal. Gerald Ford became president. Kind of a tumultuous year. Wheel of Fortune debuted, if you can believe that. Wheel of Fortune. Crazy. It was not with Pat Sajak, though. I forget who the first person was. Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen was released, and Saturday Night Live started. So it was a pretty epic year, if I do say so myself. Living in rural Minnesota, it was wonderful. The population of Minnesota at the time was 3.9 million, which, I mean, my gosh, I think since 1975 to 2021, we've grown about 45% overall in Minnesota. So, pretty cool. And in the United States, it's 219 million, and the U.S. rural population is 56.9 million, and 4 billion in the global population, which just boggles my mind because now you think about global population and it's just exploding. But in the 70s, I was born into a farm family. My parents were 19 when they got married. They had me when they were 21. That's what their friends all did. They all married their high school sweetheart. They all farmed. They all had kids. I had a great community growing up because it was all my cousins and then all of my parents' friends. And that's what you did. And we grew up in a rural area. And everything was great until the 1980s hit and the 80s farm crisis came along. And so my mom stayed home with me until I went to school and then stayed home with my younger sister for a little bit. But the 80s farm crisis came along, and that is when you saw women going and working in town because they needed the money to be able to just buy groceries. So my mom went to work at the local vet clinic in Waldorf, and I didn't know it at the time, but talking to them now, as I'm much older, that was such a pivotal moment for them because my mom and dad worked side by side with my grandparents. And so for my mom to be gone every day, and I forget what she made. I mean, it was nothing, but it paid for the groceries. It got us by. And so you saw a lot of that. And when you look in agriculture and in rural areas, you should be able to pinpoint right in that 1980s area, early 80s, of when dual income started coming in. And so, we were part of that. Now, before I go any further, I have to tell you that this is the best picture I've ever had taken of me in my entire life. This is 8th grade. Height of the 80s, that is, I had a perm, I had a hair and banana clip, and banana clips are coming back, which I'm like, please don't. But you know what, and I hate to say it, I do not have a graduation picture on this presentation, but the perm morphed and my hair got longer and I ended up with the wall. Like the big wall and the Aquanet, because that's what you did when you graduated in the early 90s. And so I put this up there because it is the height of the 80s. Big glasses. I have braces. I was the first in my class to get glasses, the first in my class to get braces, and the last one to get braces off. So I am just like stellar in the nerd category. So, but in 1988, things were happening, and you can see by the population, things are moving around. We had George H.W. Bush was president at the time, and the average income was $24,450. You compare that now, the average is about $70,000. So 1988, that $24,000. Some similarities to today. The summer of 1988 was extremely dry. There was a drought. I specifically remember that summer because I hate hot weather, and that is the year that we got central air in our old farmhouse. And I was ecstatic. But living on a farm, I was outside most of the time anyway, but I was so ecstatic. But there's a major drought just like there is now. For the fun music, Never Gonna Give You Up by Rick Astley was released, so that's an oldie but a goodie. And the Acid Washed and Ripped Jeans, which are popular again. I tell my 16-year-old niece, do not do this. But she does, as long as she doesn't start rolling her jeans, we're okay. But in 1988, that is when things really, the farm crisis really came to a head. And I can speak specifically from dairy farmers. We lost, I don't know the percentage, but the number of dairy farmers. And that's where rural life really started to change. I remember in 1988, we only had like 3 channels, the ABC, NBC, CBS, and maybe a couple other ones. But that's when like VHF, UHF, those things. So I think back to then, and that is sad to say, a lot of my humor was shaped in that 1988 to 1990 range when Fox TV was just getting started. So The Simpsons were popular, In Living Color, a lot of the humor that you can't laugh at that anymore. But that's where a lot of, it was amazing. And we didn't have MTV. I had to stay up on Friday nights until midnight to watch Friday night music videos. And that was like the best thing ever. And so it was really a pivotal time where technology was starting to come about. And so it was just a really pivotal time. And then we're going to fast forward to 2000. So in between there, I left the farm and went to the University of Minnesota. And truth be told, at first I did not want to go because it was too big. I was accepted at a small college in Northwest Iowa, private college, to study agriculture. And, I asked them what they did for fun, and they're like, oh, we go to Walmart. And I'm like, I'm not that exciting, but geez, I really need something more than Walmart to do. And so at the last minute, like April, May of my senior year, I decided, I'm like, nope, I'm not going there. I'm going to go to the University of Minnesota and tackle my fears. And again, truth be told, I hated it. I've done adjunct work at the university, and I love working with first-year students because I'm like, I don't get your position, but I've been there. I can empathize and say, yep, I had a rotten freshman year, really rotten, and I wanted to transfer to South Dakota State because that's where my friends were. But going to the University of Minnesota, I was the only one from this area that I knew of there because Waseca County is just next door to the east. Waseca had a campus, University of Minnesota Waseca, and it was a 2-year school. That's where I was going to go 2 years and then transfer up to St. Paul. That's kind of what you did around here in agriculture. Well, the campus closed the year before I graduated high school. And so lots of hard feelings with the community. They're still there. It's tough. It is now a federal prison. This is being recorded, so I won't say much, but college, federal prison. It changes. But going to the university, a lot of people were surprised that, why would you ever want to study agriculture? Because again, people were going bankrupt, losing their homes, losing everything. I was so scared as a child that we would lose our farm that one year our local banker came out. It was Christmas time, and he comes out of his nice car, and I'm looking out the window on a snowy day, and he has a turkey in his hand. And he's in a suit, and we're in our farmhouse, and I started crying because I thought he was like Ebenezer Scrooge taking our farm and bringing us a chicken because we're destitute. So my parents couldn't figure out, why is she crying? And here they had won the drawing for a turkey at the bank. But that's all we talked about then. And my parents did a really good job of keeping it away from us. But when all of your friends and their families are going through the same thing, there's stress. Things are going on. And so for me to go into agriculture and not really knowing, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to go into agriculture and help people. Well, what does that mean? I don't know. It means about 10 different things. And so going to the University of Minnesota was a leap for me in this small area. But went up there and, like I said, got a undergrad in applied economics. I switched majors a couple times. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and it was actually, I was an exchange student in Switzerland my first senior year because I did a victory lap for a fifth year. I was an exchange student, and I realized there I did not speak the language very well or at all. So it was 4 months of really intense me time. I mean, because I wanted to learn German, but my host family wanted to learn English, and they were all taking English class. And so I can not say much in Swiss German, but what I can say can't probably be repeated because I worked on a farm and you're working with animals. But I figured out when I was there that applied economics is not what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to be on the grain exchange, that I wanted to be a trader, that I wanted to trade commodities. And I realized while I was there, I'm like, I need to be with people. I want to help people. I want people to have good experiences like I did. And so I decided, I'm like, I need to get into education. But I was far enough along in my program that I'm like, well, let's finish that out. And then went and got my MED in agricultural education at the University of Minnesota. And it's kind of funny because I took a couple ag education classes in my undergrad, and the head of the agricultural education department, when I went to apply for graduate school, he's like, well, it's about time. He's like, I've been waiting for you to change your major, but I didn't. But anyway, in 2000, at this time in our time travel, 2000, I'm in graduate school. I had just actually moved back. I was working full-time and going to graduate school at the U, and then in the year 2000, I moved back to the farm. And I took a position as the 4-H educator in Waseca County. So I was very active in 4-H. That was kind of my sport, and I really, really enjoyed it. And so I came back because I wanted to give rural kids the experience that I had, that feeling of fitting in. My thing that when I was doing 4-H is I always like to challenge students and said, tell me what you're interested in. I can find a project for you. I can find somewhere for you to fit in. And that was always my challenge to them. And I don't think I ever failed finding something. But looking back on that, George W. Bush was elected president, and so this is pre-2001. I think about in my lifetime now, we have pre-9/11, I should say. I think of now we have pre-9/11 and post-9/11, and now we have pre-COVID and post-COVID. And so it's mind-boggling. I don't think I'm that old, but we'll see. Again, the fun things that were in 2000, it was Y2K, and we were all concerned that our computers were going to die. Like, whatever, that there were all these bugs, and people were preparing for Armageddon, and craziness. My aunt and uncle had their 50th wedding anniversary on New Year's Eve in Waldorf at the community center. And I decided, I'm like, well, if the world's going to end, if it ends here in Waldorf, the whole world is blowing up. So I might as well be with family and friends having a good time. And we're all here. Nothing happened. You can see here Real Slim Shady by Eminem. Velour tracksuits were popular, unfortunately. And Survivor debuted in the year 2000, which I can't believe it's been that long. I just cannot believe it. And you'll see here that the U.S. population continues to increase, but the rural population does start to decrease. We're going to skip to 2013 here, and this is the year, this was a very pivotal year. So I did 4-H for 3 years. So I came back to rural for 3 years, and I will say those were some of the best times of my life. I loved my work, but I was really split because I had a life in St. Paul already. I had been in St. Paul for 5 years. All my friends were there. I still had friends here, but it was a big difference between St. Paul and Waldorf. And so I was doing a lot of driving at the time. And so I did 4-H for 3 years, and then I moved back up to St. Paul, and I worked at the University of Minnesota on campus for 9 years. I managed a legislative council and did some adjunct faculty work. And it was funny because then when I lived in St. Paul, what would I do on the weekends? I would go home to the farm. I just need both. But St. Paul is my second home. Como Park, I love it. But during that time, that's when, you're in your 20s, 30s, what are you going to do? And, you look at what's going on during that time, and rural population is continuing to decline. Regional centers are getting bigger. Mankato's growing a little bit, Rochester's growing, St. Cloud. But I didn't want to come back here. I'm like, no. I was already here. It was great, but I missed the cities. I missed coffee, good coffee, because there was a time in Mankato before there was good coffee. Today I went to River Rock and had amazing coffee, so I'm happy. But back 9 years ago, that was not the case. You could go to Caribou or Starbucks, but I missed my good coffee, so I went back up there. But in 2013, I was given an opportunity to move to Indianapolis and to work for the National FFA, which used to stand for the Future Farmers of America. Now it just stands for the FFA, so a youth organization working with agriculture and leadership. And it was interesting because I was presented with that. They're like, we want you to apply. I got the job. And I'm like, I don't want to move to Indianapolis. But then I had a student of mine that I was advising who reminded me. He said, you always tell us you can always come home. So go. And you know how that is as faculty when you're like, dang it. I guess you're right. So I took that job. And so I was only there for 18 months. And it was great, but then another opportunity came up to go out to Washington, D.C., and that was in 2013. So 2013 was a real pivotal year for me. I accepted a job out in Washington, D.C. I think that was in September. I moved out there in November. It was intense and crazy. I loved Washington, D.C. I thought it would be great to live in, and it was. It was until it wasn't. It's many things. But let's look at the time capsule here in 2013. 2 words I never, ever, ever expected to be on a PowerPoint slide are twerk and selfie. Never. Never. But those 2 words in the year 2013 were added to the dictionary. Who knew? Justin Timberlake, 2020 experience, and the movie Frozen was released. And the song Let It Go just kept going on and on and on. And Barack Obama was our president. And like I said, rural population continued to decline slowly, not crazily, but slowly. But living in Washington, D.C., again, very different. Very different. You think from a sociologic point of view, you can't get much more different. When I was an exchange student in Switzerland, I did not have culture shock. I don't know why. I expected, I'm like, I'm not going to know the language. I'm going to figure it out. When I moved to Indianapolis, there wasn't. When I moved to Washington, D.C., that is the first time I've ever felt culture shock. I was riding a subway to work. I could walk to get my groceries. It was fantastic, but everything was so small, so compact. And it was claustrophobic for a while. I lived in a high-rise. Those of you that are old enough to remember the show The Jeffersons, I was in a high-rise in the sky. I was pretty excited. I was on the top floor. But it took me a while to adjust. But then I loved it. But I traveled a lot. And I will say my time in D.C., I was there for 4 years. And I loved what I did, but that town is you go and you work. I didn't have the opportunity, or I didn't take any opportunities to put any roots down. I was traveling for work probably 2 or 3 weeks a month, and so I would occasionally go to church, or I had my friends were work. My friends were at work. So we would work, then we would go out for happy hour. Work, go out for dinner. Whatever that was. And that's what D.C. is. Those of you that have lived there know that. It's intense. I thought I would like it. It was good until all you do is work. And you realize that, gosh, there's a lot more to life than just working. And, you get into that bubble. If you've ever heard of the Beltway bubble in the DMV, in the Washington, D.C. area, it is so true. Because you get in that bubble, and I can promise you, because it happened to me, sometimes I would be able to be in town for a couple weeks. Like, I could actually go real grocery shopping and buy fruits and vegetables because I wasn't going on a plane somewhere. And take the subway into work, take it back, take the subway into the baseball games. Like, that was public transportation. I had a car. I didn't drive it a lot. I think I had the oil changed in it once in 3 years. I did not drive much. But just that difference. So when you're in Washington, D.C., and it's just like anywhere else, when you're in your bubble, that's all that matters. And so I knew when I was in Washington, D.C., when I would see a homeless person, because they have a real issue. They have a lot of people that are unhoused and are homeless. And that always bothered me. It's like, gosh, what can I be doing? What do we do? When those people just fade into the background for me, and they're just background noise, I'm like, okay, I need to get back out with people, because they're just kind of fixtures. They're always there. And so it's like, okay, I need to get some humanity back and get back out into rural, or at least get out of the bubble. And it was interesting during my time there in Washington, D.C., I was there for the 2016 election, which is a fascinating place to be in 2016, because I always thought being in Washington, D.C. for an election, for a presidential election, would be really cool. And it was boring, because guess what? Everyone's out campaigning and doing their thing. You all recall the outcome, and everyone was shocked, just shocked. The next day, I got a taxi. I went to a meeting, I forget, across the city, but it was not, I couldn't get to it well by public transportation. So I hopped in the cab, and this was after talking to a lot of people that were just devastated about the election. And I got in there, and this gentleman, U.S. citizen, but he was a refugee from, I believe, East Africa somewhere. And I'm like, oh, what do you think? Oh, gosh, what do you think about the election? And he goes, I'm surprised, but he's like, in my country, if I tried to vote, I would have gotten killed. So we'll be fine. And I'm like, that is great perspective. Just wonderful perspective. We all got to vote if you wanted to. Nobody died. You can go on. I could go on with my day and go to my meeting. At the same time, I had staff at Farm Bureau who were from the Virginia, D.C. area and were in tears over the election. And I was trying to help them, like, what's going on? Tell me more. And at Farm Bureau, we work for the farmers. We work for rural Minnesota. And so what we did is we have a foundation, I had a foundation that we educate people about where their food, fiber, and fuel comes from. And we work with teachers and students. And so talking to my 2 staff members, who were clearly upset, and they're like, how could this happen? Da-da-da-da-da. And I asked them, I said, do you know who our members are? They're like, what do you mean? And I said, have you been out of these states? Have you gone into rural areas? Like, these are the people we represent. I'm not saying right or wrong what the election was, but have you been there? And their responses were no. Or if they were, it was for a conference. And I'm like, you have to understand where people are coming from. And at that time, actually, it was a question in my interview for this position, what do you think happened in 2016? And I'm like, wow, that's a loaded question. And I simply said, I think rural people are sick of being overlooked. And they have the power to vote, and they did. However that came out. But, representation matters. And so it's been interesting since then now, as we're moving along. But just being in Washington, D.C. was very interesting. And yeah, being there on Election Day was really boring. There was nobody around. It was kind of great. So come back now to today. So I moved back 5 years ago from Washington, D.C. And it's kind of funny because people ask me, they're like, oh my gosh, was it such a culture shock when you moved back? And I'm like, no, I knew what I was doing. I actually thought I would move back to St. Paul. That was my plan. I'm like, okay, I'll get the moving van, get the moving truck, and we'll dump everything at the farm at my parents. And I will get a place in St. Paul. While I was in Washington, D.C., I was the victim/survivor of a violent crime. And so I came back for mental health reasons, but also just to be near family. And also, I was burned out. I was sick of the rat race. The subway was on fire half the time or didn't work. I just wanted to be back. And so I came back here without a job. And I'm like, okay, I'll find something soon enough. Took a year and then some. I ended up doing, we'd do some consulting, do our thing, make some money. But I did not anticipate staying in this rural area for as long as I did. And it's the best decision I've made, being here in rural. I always thought I would come back here when I was ready to retire in another 20 years or so. But I'm so glad that I came back to a rural area because there's such a resurgence here. And not just here in Mankato, but all across Minnesota. I can't speak for the other rural areas. I mean, every state is different. But here in Minnesota, it is so much fun watching little towns really just blossom. One of my coworkers, Kelly, he lives in New London, Minnesota, so near Wilmer. Cutest little town, like under 2,000 people. They have a playhouse. They have a great coffee shop. They have a brewery. They have just so many things in this little town that people come together. Because that's one of the things that I thought I would miss, staying in a rural area. And that's something you hear from people, like, why don't you want to move to a rural area? The amenities. I want to go to the theater. I want to go to concerts, this, and this. But if you start looking, and if you're willing to drive a little bit, you can find it. I mean, here in Mankato, again, growing up here, this is the last place I wanted to end up. The last. My mom is a graduate of Mankato State and was devastated that I did not come here. I would not even do a visit because who wants to go? My mom was a non-traditional student and was in college the same time I was in college. So who wants to go to college with their mother? Not me. Not most people. And so it's been so wonderful moving back. And it's been so wonderful sharing the rural story with people. Because the people who knew me from my time in Washington, D.C., they're like, when are you moving back up to St. Paul? And I'm like, I'm not. Everything I want is here. I go to St. Paul plenty. I drive through, I have meetings, I see friends. It's not far. Again, I grew up driving 30 minutes to get groceries. Driving an hour and 15 minutes to get to St. Paul is no big deal. I do it multiple times a week. But it's so much fun when communities come together. And it's great seeing regional centers like Rochester growing. And so you can see here from the numbers, the population of Minnesota is now 5.7 million, and we're just busting wide open. But the rural population is still decreasing. And I had to think about it. I'm like, in 5 or 10 years, what are we going to look back in 2022 besides the complete dumpster fire that it's been? What's going to stick out to us? And I've determined it would be Top Gun Maverick was released. 90s fashion is back, the ripped jeans, the whole 9 yards, the high-waisted. I go into Target and I'm like, oh my gosh, like on Snapchat, the very little I'm on Snapchat, I take pictures of these clothes and I send them to my niece and I'm like, do not wear this. Just don't. Yeah, and then what does she do? She wears it. Queen Elizabeth II passed away, and then the average income is $70,000. And so I bring all that up just to talk about how did Minnesota change and how did rural change. And I referred to this map early on, but I'm going to break it down a little bit more on the continuum codes, on the commuting codes, and coming down to how do you count? And as sociologists with data, again, where's your rural? Is it an economic development area? Is it a commuting area? What are we counting? So these two maps of Minnesota are of Minnesota and the rural-urban continuum or commuting code. And the brown counties are considered metro. The green counties are considered non-metro. So basically whatever is not metro is rural. So people like to talk about, the media and other people like to talk about how rural Minnesota, rural America is dying. It's just hemorrhaging. Oh my God, nobody lives there. It's just awful. Why would you go there? It depends how you count it. And so when you look at this, on the 1974 one, the brown counties, it's like the Twin Cities Metro, Duluth, Moorhead, and Rochester. Everything else is counted as non-metro, as rural. So the non-metro population, would have been, if we kept those same, or I shouldn't even say kept, would have been 1.593 million. But instead, we go to 2013 with the commuting codes, and you can see the brown areas have expanded. Beyond the Twin Cities. Blue Earth County is included now. Le Sueur County, Nicollet County, Sibley, it has been included. And so when you look at these maps, people will be like, well, rural population decreased from 1.5 million to 1.2 million. Did it? More and more people are moving to those suburban areas. Those used to be rural areas, but now they're being counted as something different. So I always like to tell some people when they're like, well, rural's dying, and I'm like, well, the north, all around the Twin Cities, that all used to be considered rural. We can't count that anymore. We can't, depending upon how you're looking at it. But I'm like, rural Minnesota is actually growing. It's just not growing as fast as the metropolitan. And that's the story we don't hear. And that's the thing I want to bring to you today, is just talking about that narrative of I don't do a good job of selling rural. I love living here, but I don't do a good job of selling it to other people and saying that it's a great thing. I just got done with an article for MinnPost today. And they wanted me to write about, what do you wish voters in the Twin Cities knew about greater Minnesota? Like, oh my God, well, and I have 300 to 800 words to do it. Oh my gosh. Difficult, we did it, but basically, I came down to the point is I'm like, rural is not the opposite of urban. They're not opposites. They're different. We're in such a society now where it's black and white, right and wrong, urban, rural. I'm like, there's no divide. There's a misunderstanding. And there's a lot of finger pointing. It's not opposite. And so that's what I wrote about. We'll see how that goes when it gets published. But talking about growth areas in Minnesota, where we are seeing growth populations are the counties that are considered recreational. So when you're up in the northern part or the central, my friends from the very northern part of Minnesota have to correct me that Alexandria is not north, it's central. So when you're in the Central Lakes area, it is growing. Lots of second homes, things going on there. Counties where non-white populations are concentrated. So where meatpacking, vegetable processing plants are, especially Nobles in Mower County, so Hormel, and I believe it's Swift in Nobles, I forget. But that's where the population is growing. And then in the metropolitan counties, which now are considered Blue Earth and Olmsted. And it still boggles my mind that Blue Earth County is considered an urban county because in 5 minutes, I will be in a cornfield driving home. It's two different worlds, but that's how they're coding it now. So there is growth. And that's the story we need to tell people. And the regional centers are growing. It is hard to find a house anywhere, but especially in rural areas. In Mankato, in Waseca, holy cow. I'm not willing to pay. I just think back to even 6 months ago when I was looking, because I still live on the farm. I have elderly family around that I help with, and so I'm looking at buying something, and I'm like, there's no way on God's green earth I'm going to pay $500,000 for a house that's worth $250,000. Okay, so I thought with my economic brain, I'm like, okay, I'll just wait for the market to crash. That hasn't yet. But then the interest rates are out of control, so I'm just going to stay there. But people want to move to rural areas. The number one question I get asked when I'm out with people is there a huge migration of people from metropolitan to rural areas? And I have to tell them the numbers don't show me that yet, because we don't have the infrastructure together. We don't have the housing. We don't have the child care. We don't have the broadband. You know, if you want to live in Mankato and you have the money to afford somewhere to live, you can make it work. But childcare has turned into an economic development issue, and we hear so many stories anecdotally about people not able to move out of the suburban areas, to move to Wilmer, to move to Janesville, to move wherever, because they don't have childcare. They just can't. Or they don't have reliable internet. I have satellite internet out on the farm. It's okay. If I'm on a webinar, I can't host it. I come into Mankato, or I go to Waseca, and I log into somebody's Wi-Fi. Because if you're on a webinar with me and I'm hosting it, you're going to get really upset really fast, because I'll start skipping and things will be, people want to move, but we need that infrastructure. And that's something you're going to be hearing about even more. Our organization, we've turned into being the canary in the coal mine of issues important in rural Minnesota. So we were the ones 6 years ago, that really started talking about childcare and how it's a problem, and how in rural it's more family child care providers, and in urban it's more centers. And so talking about those disparities. COVID happened, people realized child care is a huge issue and there's a huge shortage, so now they're starting to do something about it. You know, you think about infrastructure as well, another thing that we're looking at is rural EMS. If I call 911 at our farm, we have a wonderful volunteer fire department, the whole 9 yards, but it's going to take some time to get me to Mankato. You know, it's a solid, well, if you want to get from my farm to ISJ, I still call it ISJ, to the hospital here, it'll be a half hour just to get through town. Well, do you have a half hour? And it's hard finding volunteers to want to do that. And so there's a lot of things in rural infrastructure that we need to be looking at. One of the questions that I always like to ask is also brain drain or brain gain. We hear all the time, and I'm sure you all do that. Again, everyone's leaving rural. There's no young people. We want people to stay. 18-year-olds leave home. This is not a news story. 18-year-olds leave home in Edina. They leave home in Madison Lake. They leave home in Alexandria. That's what they do. And so I really think that we've all been focusing on the wrong thing. Let them go. Go learn new things, experience things. Then come back. Show us what you learned. Tell us where you were. Help us expand our knowledge. And what we're seeing is between the ages of 30 and 49, that's where the increase in population is. People are wanting to come back to a rural area to raise their families, to be closer to their family. And so there's a real brain gain. And so the narrative that I truly believe we need to be telling is there's a brain gain of, like, now it's millennials wanting to move to rural areas. They want a slower pace of life, or they want smaller school sizes. And so, again, negative always draws the media, but there's positives. People are wanting to move. And it's not just Mankato that has a housing shortage. In Janesville, the lots that were, all the lots are sold now in Janesville. Those things were for sale for 25 years or something like that. They're all sold now. You try buying almost anywhere around the state, it's crazy. So there's people coming in. Want to quickly just talk about diversity as well, because again, we also hear that rural must mean all white, and that is not the case. In rural Minnesota, it's definitely in pockets. It's definitely where those manufacturing facilities are. And so actually, when you look at the data, rural has been diversifying at almost as fast of a rate as the metro. When you distinctly look at Nobles County, Mower County, up in Pelican Rapids, immigration, diversity has been growing greatly. And people are, I hope, finally realizing that in order to grow our population, we need good immigration policy. Because Gen Xers like myself, I do not have kids, I have cats. Cats don't do economic development, at least mine don't. You know, and it's really interesting. I work with a lot of baby boomers, and people are so surprised. They're like, oh, there's a workforce shortage, da-da-da-da-da. And I'm like, have we not known you're going to be retiring for 65, 75 years? Did we not see this coming? Now, granted, COVID really sped it up, but we have, you know, people talk about the workforce shortage and they say, oh, people are lazy, they're not working. No, we do not have people. The baby boomers are retiring, and rest of us did not reproduce as much as that. That's the bottom line, numbers. And it's the way it's going to be. And so we need to really look at good immigration policy, especially in rural areas. How can we get people here and make it welcoming? I know one thing we were talking about last week, we were talking about housing, but talking about with immigrant families especially, there's a lack of housing, but there's a lack of housing for multi-generational families. So they might need an apartment or a townhouse that has 4 or 5 bedrooms because they have multiple levels of family living with them. Those aren't available readily. So what can we do to be thinking about that to make sure that we have that available and it's welcoming? So what does all of this mean in our little time travel of how things changed is, you know, it's up to us to change the rural narrative. And it's up to us to tell that story. We know the numbers. We have the numbers. We need to get them to talk. How can we, you know, when I started 5 years ago, our organization was started, we're a research organization, but we were started doing more academic research, white paper research. And over the years, we've gone away from that. It's still valid research, but it's not peer-reviewed or anything. And we're partially funded by the state, and we're partially funded by private foundations. And so we are very nonpartisan. So we're like a think tank, but there's just 3 of us. And we all have cats and not kids. So there you go. But you know, what does that look like for us? And so changing that narrative, where are we at? What are we doing? And now I just lost my train of thought, but anyway, where I was going with that. Oh, talking about, so when I was going to the legislature 4 years ago, asking to renew our funding, I was basically told, no, I don't want any white paper research. Your research isn't valid. Great. Okay, I'm going to have to fire myself and my staff. So what we did is a complete, which will be for you guys, for you in this room and at home, will be very natural. We turn that data into information, into maps and charts and graphs and interactive, into videos, the whole 9 yards. Guess what? People responded. People like it. Legislators who are decision makers are our main audience. So county commissioners, township people, city councils, legislators, federal government, all of them. The easier we can make it for them, the better. They are not going to sit and read a 15-page research paper on housing. But I can maybe get them to read a 1-page back and double-sided in color with some fun charts and graphs. Maybe, if I'm lucky. But we're starting to see that more. And again, you all know that, but we have to make sure that we're keeping up with technology. And we're not going to get into Snapchat. We're discussing Instagram, but Twitter and Facebook are enough for us to deal with, and LinkedIn. But we have to tell that story, change that narrative. Where are we at? What are we about? And not be afraid to tell our stories. Because, in Minnesota, I don't want to say It's like passive aggressive. Yes, I'm passive aggressive. I'm from Minnesota. I didn't realize that till I moved away. Different story, different day. But we are, I think, more humble in Minnesota. We don't want to say things. It's just like, leave me alone. Yep, we're doing great things here in New London. Da 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 da. No, tell the stories. Tell them loud. And it's not disparaging anyone. Be proud of where you're from. I am from a town of 201 now, the sign says. Honestly, I don't know most of them anymore. They commute into Mankato, into Waseca, into Mapleton. Cheaper housing there. Trying to build community is hard. If I didn't have family immediately around, it would be difficult. But you know, when I think of changing the rural narrative, it's talking about that community. Because I really do believe in rural areas that we do come together more. When I lived in the Washington, D.C. area amidst millions of people, I have never been so lonely in my entire life. And I moved back here to the town of 200, and it's instant community. I know when I go vote, they'll have my sticker ready, and they'll be like, there's your name. Good and bad, but community, I think that's what we really need to focus on in rural, is that community, and that's where our strength is. Not that there's not community. Again, it's not good and bad, but I believe we have an advantage in rural areas that we can really build community, and that's what people are lacking, especially in this age of social media. I mean, during COVID, we learned that. I need people. We all need people, even us. I'm kind of a borderline extrovert, introvert, but introverts need people too. You need some interaction. You need to go to a coffee shop and work. And so I think that's where we really, can promote rural. And so that's one of the reasons, that is the main reason I came back, was that community. And so again, I never thought in a million years I would be back on the farm as quickly as I was, even though it was 20-some years, but it's the best decision I've ever made. I hope that you can encourage, with your research, that you can encourage people to tell their story and help rural Minnesota out, rural America out. So with that, I'll thank you. My email and our website is on there. I should mention our website, we have a host of interactive maps. If you go on our atlas, have at it. You can search all of our reports, the whole 9 yards. We do have a blog and a podcast, and we do webinars whenever. Typically when we release a research report, we have a webinar, and then we post them all on our YouTube channel. And so we just posted one on rural EMS and another one on childcare, success stories. And so coming up in the future, we will be doing rural mental health and actually looking at the workforce for rural mental health. We know there's a significant problem with mental health, but no one has talked about the workforce yet. And so we're actually partnering with MSU, with Minnesota State, working on this research. So we're really excited to be working with the university on that. But go on there, take a look. It's all free. Use it, share it, love it, whatever you like. But thank you for your time, and I hope my story helped bring some clarity as to why someone would leave and come back, and what we can do to help rural Minnesota out. Seifel.
Can we take some questions?
You're the boss, you tell me.
Yep.
Okay.
If that is okay.
Thanks so much for a really interesting and inspiring talk. Your point about changing the narrative really had me thinking a lot about the students I talk with. So many of them, I'm a faculty member here, so many of them are from rural communities nearby. And when I talk to them about long-term plans, I hear a lot of that narrative, right? I hear a lot of rural places are boring. And I also hear, to be fair, a lot of like, Mankato's overwhelming, I got to go back, right? But among those who say that they plan to not go back. It's often echoing that sort of narrative of rural places as, boring and lacking amenities and that sort of thing. But the other thing that I hear from them a lot that I just wanted to return to, because I know you mentioned this briefly in your talk, was sort of, and it sort of takes two forms, but they're often interrelated. It's racism and it's Trumpism, right? And so I heard you talk a little about diversity, but nothing about racism. And so I kind of just want to come back to that. And I just wonder, you shared with us some of the data about diversification, how rural areas are diversifying, but at a slower pace than in urban areas. So, how do you talk, right, and how do you advocate for changing that rural narrative when the narrative centers around rural places host so much racism, xenophobia, white supremacy?
Yep.
Yeah, how do you talk about that?
Good question. Loaded question.
Totally open-ended, whatever you got to say.
But I think about it because I come from a very conservative family and whatnot, and I'm really glad that I've had the outside experiences I've had and met people that are different from me, because I truly believe that most people are good, but they have not left their rural area, or they have not left what they know. Go and have someone, go to San Francisco, whatever. I just don't think people they're not willing to have that shared or lived experience. And so when I have friends or family talking about Fox News, I try not to roll my eyes, but I have to remind myself, I'm like, tell me why you think this. I want to know why. And just like my progressive, whatever you want to label them, friends, some here in rural areas, but mainly in urban, okay, tell me why you're thinking this, because I think everyone wants to label everything. And again, right or wrong, good or bad. And it's like, we need just as many rural people going and talking with urban people, living some experiences, meeting people. As we need urban people coming to rural areas and actually seeing what it's like here. And that's hard. And so when you talk about racism, it's hard. It's hard. And I really applaud people of color that are willing to move to rural areas. You're seeing in Nobles County, Mower County with a refugee population. It's great because the families, they're starting to build there. The Latino population is getting to be, I think the largest Latino population actually is in Nobles County, in Worthington. And we actually did a research study on childcare issues in Worthington, and it's hard in Worthington for so many different reasons, but focusing on the Latino community. And so I give people a lot of credit because it's not easy, and I think a lot of it is that people are scared. They're scared because they don't know, and they watch TV too much, or they're on social media too much, and they think that, I don't know, what was it? Were we going to have like 1 million refugees resettled here in Minnesota or something? Which is totally not true. But people see it and they believe it. And then all of a sudden their mind goes to, I don't like these people. Well, you don't even know them. How can you do that? And so if we could figure out a way to like short out some of that, because it's like, you don't know them. But just getting people to have better experiences. But thinking about people staying in Mankato area or not. I have a lot of cousins that, they came to Mankato State. I still call it Mankato State. I'm sorry. No, I'm not. Not really. I'm not. But they're in the cities now, living downtown, doing whatever. They want to come back. They're like, we're happy to be up here right now. When we start having kids, we want to move back. And that, again, is that brain gain. That's what I hear more and more. And as our parents get older and family gets older, I really think that that's going to be, with the baby boomers obviously getting older, we're going to be seeing a lot more of that between the ages of 30 and 49 really coming back. So stay tuned.
Thank you.
can share one experience to that. You're talking about Janesville. So when I came here, I moved to Janesville. I bought
really?
a house at Janesville, and my house is at a community. I'm the only person. My wife and I are brown there. So and the people around me. I was sure that they have never seen a brown person there. On the second week, I didn't know that I have to cut grass. And I have to buy a machine to cut grasses. So somebody complained at the city, and then I got a notice, And then I went to Home Depot and cut a grass. And then I started growing roses. So I have about 40 varieties now.
Oh, wow.
So and that has become a public attraction. So kids come, dogs come to us now. Exposure. Exposure, I think, really creates a lot of difference. Exposure to diversity, and that's, I think, from my experience, is the ice breaking.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just add on to that too. Communities need to be very proactive on working with immigrant and refugee populations, or new people there in general. The city of Austin is doing an amazing job of welcoming new people to their community. Austin has come a long ways, and they now are very integrated into, if you're new in town, they have the welcome packet, but they want you involved. They want to tell you, hey, you need to cut your grass, but in a nice way. And here's some neighbors and this and that. So they're trying to have more social events, just getting people together and, having some exposure.
Hi.
Hi.
I want to thank you for a really interesting talk, and I want to say that I myself am a new transplant to the state and to this more rural, air quote, rural part of the country. And you alluded to some of the issues when you talked about childcare and responsibilities of family members, usually gendered roles that women have to fulfill. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that, either through your data or through the concerns that you've seen expressed from your constituents about the gendered component of rural work and rural development.
Yes, very much. Thank you for reading our research. After COVID, it has become very apparent that more women are leaving the workforce than men. And that is because they typically are the lead caregivers. And so when we're talking about a shortage of workers, I'm curious to find out the data. It's still too early to tell, but I am really curious to find out how many women actually left the workforce to stay at home with their kids because either one, they couldn't find daycare or they couldn't afford it. And so it really is a gender issue. And so how do we work through that? And there's a lot of, there's some ideas out there. I'll refer to Hormel in Austin and also Land O'Lakes in the Twin Cities. Land O'Lakes has their own child care facility, and their employees can utilize it. I don't know the specifics, but Hormel is looking at the same thing. And that is something that, as a society, we need to be looking at. It's not just that the government will provide for me or this will provide for me, but what's the partnership? So what does it look like for there to be enough childcare in the area? I know Lake Crystal next door has tried some ideas. They're figuring it out as a partnership. And how do we do that? And so it's fascinating because so the one thing that we're focusing on is also the majority of family childcare providers and center providers are female. Being able to pay a livable wage to them is really difficult. You have that yin and yang of you need to have affordable childcare, but these people have to make a living. And I realized not too long ago that one of my dear friends in Janesville is a child care provider, and I equate it to growing up on a dairy farm. Being a dairy farmer is a lifestyle. My parents were never in it for the money. They were in it for the lifestyle. They loved it. They love raising their kids there. It's a business. You need to make money. That needs to be important. Kind of like childcare. My friend does it because she loves it. She's a foster mom. Everything she needs. It is a business. So you have to figure that out first. And so it's trying to merge that lifestyle with trying to make a living. And it's hard. And so one of the things that we're recommending to the state is looking into that. How do we fix that? It's a system problem. But what do we do to help, especially those family child care providers? How do we help them? Is it a tax credit? Is it a subsidy? What is it to help them get up to where they need to be so that it's worth being a child care provider? Because it's an extremely important job. You're leaving your child with them for 8 to 10 hours a day. It's very important. They should be paid well and fairly. So thanks for the question.
I just wanted to update you on the Waseca facility you talked about, going from a college to a prison. Well, Mankato actually has a college degree program at that prison right now. So
awesome!
Yeah.
Yes, that's great. You know, it's been that is really good to hear because speaking candidly, being from the Waseca area, it was just such an economic. It was just devastating because Waseca's a manufacturing town, always has been, but having the college there, we had white collar, people there. It was just a nice mix. And when the prison came to town, they were like, "Oh, there's going to be all these jobs," and most of the people that work at the prison don't live in Waseca. But you know what? They're full of houses too. So that is great to hear that they're having those programs. That's wonderful. I know, Matt Loaiza, he was telling me he's going to be teaching over there next semester maybe, but that's wonderful. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Look at that, it's 7:31, only a minute late.
Yeah. One last quick questions from me, actually. So this summer, I went to Bangladesh. I was born in Bangladesh. So I went to and stayed at an... since you are leading a research organization that's focused in rural area, rural development. So I went and spent a week at Bangladesh Academy for Rural Development, BARD, that's how they call it. So what they do that, so they're like as a research organization and a bigger facility like a university, like we here at a rural setting there. And they have the the government employees and also the local government employees for various reasons, regions, they come there to develop training facilities there on rural issues, rural areas. And at the same time, they have model villages nearby. I went there to learn that how they have been working. Mm-hmm. And since you are advocating at the Minnesota Capitol there, and that's something my question, it could be a question and a comment too. And we have our university at a rural setting, and we have organizations like CRPD. So, and if we could contribute that way, bringing people from the capital to our areas for that, and have them buy in that they need to, in order to know about rural people, they have to come to rural people.
No, I agree, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up. We partner with the Citizens League, and we do talks called Interconnected. And our next one will be in November 10th, I believe. And we're talking about tech equity. So we try to find topics that both rural and urban can relate to. And we talk about, when you talk about tech equity, there's just as much of a tech equity problem in very inner city Minneapolis, St. Paul, as there is out in Waldorf. There's actually a lot more that these communities have in common than not. Access to health care, it's hard. And it's hard in certain areas in Minneapolis and St. Paul, too. And so it's getting people to realize that, and it's coming at it from, hey, we all want good health care. We all want to have access to the internet, but here's why it's different. And so that's something that we really we don't promote a distinct policy. We're not an advocacy organization, and that's really hard for me because my background is advocacy. But just helping people realize, no, we want good infrastructure. We care about education, but it's going to look different here. It's not a broad brush. And actually, the MinnPost article that I just turned in, I wrote that. I said, let's elect people that are willing to do the work and look at the nuance. One size does not fit all. A perfect example of that is at DEED, Department of Economic Development. They do a great job. They're one of our funders. But in some of their grant applications, the questioning immediately excludes rural because it's asking about how many people are impacted, how many people of color, this and this. Well, if there's not people of color in your area, it's out. And so they've changed it, but rural communities were at a disadvantage in funding just because they didn't have the information to give. And so it's those types of things to be thinking about, what can we be doing? Or even foundations, private foundations. We're fortunate we're funded partially by the Blandin Foundation and the McKnight Foundation, but I believe it's 70% or 80% of private foundation funding in the state goes to the metropolitan area. That's fine, but what do we have to do to get in on that? And so it's telling that story. And I'll just leave this one comment with the McKnight Foundation. They were funding us. They've been with us since the beginning, since early 2000s. And they went through a big restructuring 2 years ago. And, they do great work. They realigned. We ended up losing our funding. And it came down to relationships because they were inundated with grant applications and trying to figure out their new strategic plan. And so we were pretty devastated that we lost their funding, but they gave us, I call, a parting gift for a year of funding so we could figure it out. But then once we were able to tell our story and say, hey, here's actually what we do, and here's why it's important to you, and here's why it's important to equity, because that's really the angle we went at it from, because we fully realize that we do not have good research on equity and equality in rural areas. We just don't. And so we want to try and fix that. And so we're working with McKnight on that and with Blandin, being able to say, okay, in the Native American population, what research is going to be the most helpful for you? And just depending upon those populations, what is it that we can do? Because people are starting to realize that nonpartisan, non-biased data is a good thing. You can find it on the internet, but it's a good thing. So getting people out and about, don't watch the news, or at least read a book. I don't know, something, but so. Yeah, thank you. Seifel, I didn't know you lived in Janesville. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you. I didn't know you lived in Janesville. I graduated from Janesville.
Oh, Janesville High School?
Janesville, Waldorf, Pemberton, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, what part of town do you live in?
Allen Circle, just beside the high school.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.